Recording now.
Yes, please. Thanks, Mark. Welcome to those in attendance at this remote meeting of the local review body of Aberdeen City Council. Please note that the meeting will be recorded and published online for public access after the meeting. Can all attendees mute their microphone when not speaking? You can leave your camera on given there's a limited number of participants, so I'm quite comfortable for you to leave your cameras on. I will now ask the clerk to undertake a roll call of the members participating today for all members to confirm their attendance once their name has been announced by the clerk, so that it's clear in the recording of the meeting and can also be recorded by the clerk for a minute. Mr. Masson.
Thank you, Chair. So the chairperson today is Councillor Bolton.
I'm here.
Councillor Bell.
Present.
Councillor Avril Mackenzie.
Here.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Masson. As the local review body contains quasi-judicial business, members are reminded that they should not leave the room or meet during the consideration of any of the applications. The meeting has been convened in response to 3 requests for a review of the decision taken by the appointed officer under the Council scheme of delegation. Members of the local review body have before them copies of the review documents as listed in the notice calling the meeting. I, Councillor Bolton, will be the chairperson. I will now ask Mr. Masson, Assistant Clerk, to outline the procedure to follow to conduct these reviews. Mr. Masson.
Thank you, Chairperson. Members have the procedure note which was circulated with the meeting papers and is intended to set out the wider framework within which the review process operates. From this, it is clear that the first task for the review body is to come to a decision on whether the review documents contain sufficient information for the case to be determined without further procedure. And by that, it is meant without further information or representations. To assist, I feel it would be helpful to mention the following. Firstly, that the regulations governing the local review process require that all matters which the applicant intends to raise in the review must be set out in or accompany the notice of review. Secondly, that the focus of the review should be on the basis of what was before the appointed officer when a decision was made, and only in exceptional circumstances will new or additional matters be permitted to be taken into account. Thirdly, to note that the modernisation of the planning system, which included revisal of the planning appeals process, of which this local review body is part, removed the previous right on the part of an applicant to insist on a hearing and replaced that with the local review body, providing them with the power to choose a procedure which more accurately reflects the facts and circumstances of the individual case. And lastly, that guidance issued by the Scottish Government's Chief Planner in 2011 stated that reviews by local review bodies should be conducted by means of full consideration of the application afresh. This review should take the form of a structured discussion led by the chairperson to consider the matter set out in the notice of review before you. And I would conclude by drawing your attention in particular to points 10 to 12 of the procedure note. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Masson. So turning to agenda proper, I just confirm that members have the procedure note at 1.1. Okay, thank you. Right, we'll move on to 2.1. Turning to consideration of the first review in respect of a decision to refuse the application for the formation of a driveway at 90 Polworth Road, planning reference number 191406/DPP. We will now hear from the planning advisor in attendance, Mr. Gavin Evans, who will provide us with a brief description of the application proposal and a reminder of the reasons why the application was refused. I would point out that Mr. Evans attends today's meeting to provide us with the necessary professional planning guidance. He has not been involved in the earlier consideration of the application under review. Mr. Evans will, however, not be asked to express any view on the merits of the proposed development, and in effect, his role will be a neutral one involving the provision of factual information and guidance only. That said, Mr. Evans, over to you.
Thank you, Convener. I'll just see if we can get the agenda so you can see these slides. Just let me know if you can see those.
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Perfect. Okay, thank you. So yes, as you said, Convener, what we have before us today is a request for review against an application refused under delegated powers for the formation of a driveway at 90 Polworth Road. The review was submitted with all the necessary information and within the time limit of 3 months following the appointed officer's decision. The review note states that new matters have been raised in this application for review, on the basis that details of the refusal weren't known at the time of the original application. However, having reviewed the submissions, it doesn't appear that any new matters have actually been raised. The appellants simply made their case in a short statement with some photos of local driveways appended. Such statements aren't ordinarily
You're frozen,
considered.
Mr.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay. You're back.
Back again.
Yeah.
So sorry, I was just saying that whilst the applicant has ticked the box to say that new matters have been raised, having reviewed the submissions, it doesn't appear that any new matters sort of meeting that test have actually been submitted. Simply a statement in support of the review with some photos appended. So it's ultimately for members to decide whether you consider that to represent new matters being raised, but it's certainly not much different from what we would normally expect to see at the review stage. So just moving on to a brief description of the site, I've got a location and an aerial view, and unfortunately a slightly outdated street view image. So the application site's located on the southern side of Polwarth Road and comprises the ground floor flat within a 2-storey 4-in-a-block building, which has both front and rear gardens. The area, the surrounding area, is predominantly residential in character, and it's zoned within an H1 residential area in the Aberdeen Local Development Plan. Such 4-in-a-block properties on this street don't generally have access to their own driveways and are reliant on street car parking. The site's not within a controlled parking zone. So I've got an aerial view there. So you can just about make out that there are 4-in-a-block properties on the southern side of the street, but then there are sort of semi-detached and detached houses on the opposite side in the north, many of which have their own driveways, but that's not such a feature on the southern side of the street. And then if I just show you that street view image, this is the application property here, just the ground floor property on the right hand side with the picket fence there. And you can see there's no double yellow lines or anything, it's unrestricted parking here. So turning to the proposal, so planning permission sought for the formation of a tarmac driveway at the front of the property. We've got the existing image on the left and proposed on the right there. So what's currently a lawn, which if we flick back, gives you an indication of what's there at the moment. So it's proposed to form a new tarmac driveway to the front of the property, measuring approximately 3.9 metres deep from the edge of the pavement by 9.8 metres wide. This is the area to the right hand side of the plot when viewed from the street. A new 5-metre long dropped curb would also be formed. You can just see that on the next image here. It's the extent of the dropped curb that's intended to serve the driveway area. It's worth noting that a separate permission via the Roads Authority would be required for the formation of that dropped curb. And a section of the existing boundary fence adjacent to that is shown. You can just see this annotation is being lowered in order to assist with visibility. In terms of planning history for the site, the officer's report highlights no relevant planning history for this site, and a search of the planning portals confirmed that. Turning to, sorry, this is just a construction detail that was submitted. It's perhaps for the more technically minded, but just showing the composition of the surface there. Turning to the reasons for the appointed officer's refusal. Firstly, road safety. The driveway was seen to be of insufficient depth to allow for the parking of vehicles at right angles to the road without vehicles overhanging the pavement. And that was seen to be contrary to the requirements of the Council's Transport and Accessibility Supplementary Guidance. If vehicles were to be parked parallel to the road, visibility wouldn't be adequate on exiting the driveway. In terms of amenity, the removal of the soft landscaped front garden and loss of the boundary enclosure along the edge of the plot would be detrimental to the character and visual amenity of the surrounding area, which was seen to be in conflict with policies D1 relating to quality placemaking by design and H1 relating to residential areas. There's also the loss of on-street parking raised. The proposal was seen to result in a loss of potentially up to 3 on-street parking spaces. Decision notice highlights a lack of off-street parking for the 4-in-a-block properties on the southern side of Polwarth Road, and a consequent reliance on street spaces, and identifies conflict with the Council's Transport and Accessibility Supplementary Guidance. And then in terms of precedent, it was highlighted that the potential cumulative effect of similar proposals in terms of the impact on pedestrian safety and removal of both on-street spaces and front gardens would be unwelcome. In terms of the appellant's case, set out in a brief supporting statement, which is included in the agenda pack. It contends that there are similar properties of the same type in Torry, which have smaller driveways than that which is proposed. There are photographs provided, which I've got here. I don't have specific addresses, so I haven't been able to look into this in any depth, but these are understood to be in Tullis Crescent, Glenbervie Road and Mansfield Place. So just flicking through, and just something that stands out obviously is that if we're looking at this property here or either of these properties, you can see that in that instance there's obviously sufficient depth in terms of the driveway to prevent a vehicle having to hang over onto the footway and cause an obstruction to pedestrians. So need to just be mindful of, you know, where the circumstances might be different in these examples, and indeed whether they actually have planning permission in the first place. So argues also that a new housing development around the corner on Walker Gardens has changed the character of the area. I believe that's referring to the former prison site, which was recently redeveloped, and properties there benefit from driveways, at least some of them do. Highlights that there are driveways on the northern side of Polworth Road. As I mentioned, those are sort of detached and semi-detached properties where depending on exactly how a driveway was being formed, there might actually be permitted development rights that would allow for that to be done without planning permission. And lastly, contends that the formation of a new dropped curb would remove less than 1 car length from the street, which is currently available for on-street parking. That may be the case in terms of the dropped curb itself, but then you would expect a reasonable degree of visibility to be maintained on either side of that in order to allow the car to exit the driveway. So in terms of consultation and objections, the Council's Roads Development Management team recommended that this application be refused, highlighted the inadequate driveway length, which would be contrary to Aberdeen City Council's guidance, and would risk parked vehicles overhanging the footway and presenting a hazard for pedestrians. Torry's Community Council isn't presently active or established, so there was no response from the local community council there. In terms of representations, there were 4 objections received, including one from Aberdeen Civic Society, all expressing objection to the proposal. Reasons given included safety concerns for both pedestrians and vehicles when crossing the footway, and also for other vehicles once parked vehicles had rejoined the carriageway. Reference was made to previous accidents on this road. The loss of public parking space on a road where it's in high demand was also cited, and the removal of a boundary enclosure was seen to have an adverse impact on the streetscape, and approval of this proposal was seen as setting a poor precedent for the wider area. So in that case, thinking about what would happen if this was repeated multiple times up and down the street and what the effects of that might be. So in terms of further procedure there, the applicant has expressed the view that further procedure is required, having ticked all the boxes in the form and stated any of the above. So really it's down to members to determine what you think's best. So those options would be further written submissions, 1 or more hearing sessions being held, a site inspection or site visit, or lastly an assessment just based on the review of these documents with no further procedure. So I'll just stop sharing my screen and hand back to you there, Convener.
Thanks very much, Mr. Evans. As we've heard from Mr. Evans, we now need to consider whether we have sufficient information in front of us to take a decision on the application. Members will note that the applicant has stated in the review documents that the local review should undertake site visit, receive further written submissions, or hold 1 or more hearings and assess all reviewed documents before determination. Members, obviously I need to ask you if you feel you have enough information to take the decision today, or you can request one of the various other procedures that are available. My personal view is I think there's sufficient information in front of us today. The photographs I think have been helpful, and I do know the area and did a little bit of Googling myself prior to this meeting. However, I'll be guided by yourself, Councillor Mackenzie.
I agree that there is sufficient information to make a sound decision.
Thank you. Councillor Bell?
Yeah, I believe there is ample information. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, with that in mind, if I could now turn back to Mr. Evans to give us the consideration of the relevant policies and other considerations that we should be thinking.
Thank you, Convener. I'll just share my screen again here. Oh, sorry, I think I forgot to show you this this last slide. That was just giving you an indication of where those streets where examples were shown are relative to the application site, which is in red there. So not immediately nearby anyway. So turning to relevant policy considerations, as I mentioned before, the application site's located in an area zoned as an H1 residential area in the local development plan. And policy H1 applies, setting out a series of criteria to be satisfied by all new developments. Firstly, development should not constitute overdevelopment of a given plot, shouldn't result in an unacceptable impact on the character and amenity of the surrounding area, and should comply with relevant supplementary guidance. In this case, the relevant supplementary guidance relating to driveways is contained in the Council's Transport and Accessibility Supplementary Guidance document. So if I turn to that first, this sets out some criteria for new driveways, stating that permission won't normally be granted if a driveway for one car would remove on-street car parking, which is publicly available to others. So this proposal provides one off-street space, but has removed at least one on-street space. The officer's report refers to potentially up to 3. So that space or spaces on the public road can be used by anyone, whereas the proposal here would benefit only the applicant. Next, where a building is in multiple ownership, the formation of an access driveway for one or more owners should not result in the remaining owners having no opportunity to park in the street adjacent to their property. Now, whilst this proposal wouldn't totally remove the opportunity for other residents in the 4-in-a-block building to park, it would arguably reduce the prospect of finding a space by taking away one publicly accessible on-street space. The guidance continues, consent will not normally be granted for parking in garden areas to the front of tenement flats. So just looking briefly at the definition of what a tenement is in the Tenement Scotland Act, it's clear that this property would fall within that definition. So consent would not normally be granted for parking in front garden areas of tenement flats. Distance from a junction, it's normally required that new driveways are 15 metres from a junction. However, 10 metres can be okay in some circumstances. It's not close to a junction in this case, approximately 60 metres to the junction with Oscar Road to the east and 50 metres from Grampian Road to the west. In terms of dimensions, driveways should be a minimum of 5 metres long, and if more than 7 metres must achieve 10 to avoid overhanging of the footway. So that's referring to 1 car length or 2 car lengths, so not half a car length and not 1.5 car lengths. So in this case, the depth of the driveway is 3.9 metres, so clearly less than the required 5. Driveways, lastly, must be internally drained. The plans show a channel drain between the driveway and the public pavement, so that would prevent water shedding onto the public road. So just turning back now to policy D1, this relates to design quality and requires development to be of a high standard of design which demonstrates an understanding of its context. This makes reference to, you just see in bold on that slide, the 6 essential qualities of good placemaking. Some of these perhaps more relevant than others, but You might see that safe and pleasant and easy to move around perhaps stand out as being the most relevant there in the context of pedestrian and vehicle interaction and the potential hazard that was identified by our roads colleagues. So just key points really. First and foremost, do members consider that this is overdevelopment? Do you consider that it would comply with the relevant transport and supplementary guidance, transport and accessibility supplementary guidance, excuse me, and would it result in an unacceptable impact on the character and amenity of the surrounding area? Is the design of a high standard, and would it have an adverse effect on its context? And lastly, would it set any precedent for other similar developments if, you know, in terms of cumulative impact, if this were to be repeated? I'm happy to assist with conditions if members are minded to approve, and I'll just hand back to you there, convener.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Evans. Have we got questions for Mr. Evans? Councillor Mackenzie.
No, nothing. I think it's been very well covered.
Okay, Councillor Bell.
Yes, I have some questions, please, convener. I have several questions. So, Mr. Evans, what would there be to stop other owners in the block actually parking in the parking space? And so to do that, they'll then be straddling the pavement. So how would you prevent? How would that be prevented in the design?
Sorry, could you repeat that one for me?
Okay, so the parking space orientation is parallel to the pavement, and that's to get the lane of the motor car. So what would be to stop other owners in that block actually parking in that bay?
Sorry, I don't really know if that's. I understand what the question is, Councillor Bell, but I don't think that's really
okay, so there's nothing. All right. All right. Okay. All right.
Essentially, nothing is the answer. Yes. Okay. It's just simple
okay.
property.
So, all right. Okay. Well, let me try a different question then, please, convener. How would the space be accessed? How would you guarantee you can access that parking space safely on the road?
Well, I
mean, presumably you need
that.
Well, you need a drop curb, don't you? You need a drop curb, and you need someone not to be parked over that drop curb.
Yeah.
How could you guarantee that? That presumably is a valid question, isn't it, convener?
Yeah, but the service would like to try and. I think
I'm not entirely sure if it's a question for me, to be perfectly honest. I mean, what we're looking at is what's in front of us. How would I guarantee that somebody didn't?
Yeah, I think perhaps, Councillor Bell, what we've got to establish is if the request for having a car parking space in the front of the house, or driveway as it's called, is acceptable in terms of the planning policies that we currently have. And we've had it obviously raised by officers that from their roads teams that they believe there's a safety issue, that there's also the impact of the car potentially hanging onto the driveway, loss of spaces to other people. So those are the kind of the facts that they've been put to us, and it's up to us to determine. I think Mr. Evans can't really give his view on how people may access it or not. So
right. It's
really about the principle of the driveway.
Okay, well, the principle of the driveway then, convener. Yeah. So one of the submissions that Mr. Evans made was safe access, wasn't it?
Yeah.
So this is related to safe access. So how would you guarantee safe access onto and off the drive, or onto and off the parking space? I mean, that was part of the submission.
Yeah. All I would say is, Councillor Bell, if you remember back at the start of my spiel, Mr. Evans is not here to provide us with a view on the merits of the application. He can only present the facts that have already been articulated by the other officers. And if you go to the report by our roads team, they do actually give you information that they feel is not a safe suggestion in terms of having a driveway there. So perhaps that might give you some. I think we just have to be careful that Mr. Evans is not being asked to draw away from the facts that's been already presented. So Mr. Evans, unless you could repeat the road officer's contribution might be helpful for Councillor Bell.
Yep. So the roads team's response highlighted that the inadequate depth, which is contrary to the council's guidance, would risk parked vehicles overhanging the footway, presenting a hazard for pedestrians. Ultimately, for driveways, our roads guidance requires that vehicles enter at right angles to the carriageway in order that drivers have good visibility on both sides. So if a car were to be accessing to use a space which is parallel to the carriageway in this way, when they're trying to exit the space, their visibility is hindered, if you like.
Okay, that clarifies it for me. Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions, Councillor Bell?
No, that's fine. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Bell. I'm not trying to be obtrusive, but I'm just trying to make sure that we stick to the rules of the LRB. Okay, if there's no further questions, I don't have any questions. I think Mr. Evans articulated all the points quite clearly for me. We've obviously heard that there's safety implications, the impact on other residential amenity of other residents, but also on the character, I think, of the area. Now, we've heard from the applicant that there's other streets with drives on a 4 block. However, what we don't see is in this immediate vicinity, and when I say immediate vicinity, I'm talking about the length of that road, other than the other side of the road, which is a different type of house. So I'm actually comfortable with our officer's recommendation on this one. Councillor Mackenzie.
I'm happy with the recommendations as well.
Councillor Bell?
Yes, I'm happy with the recommendations. Thank you.
Okay, so if I could just confirm then that all 3 councillors have agreed with the officer's recommendation, which is to refuse the application and uphold the officer's decision. Mr. Massey, do you need anything else from us to complete this?
No, that was clear for me.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, now turning to consideration of the second review in respect of the decision to refuse the application for the formation of a dormer to the rear and the installation of a roof lights to the front, 189 Bonaccord Street, planning reference number 200068/PPP. We will now hear from the planning advisor, Mr. Gavin Evans, who will provide us with a brief description of the application proposal and a reminder of the reasons why the application was refused. I would again point out that Mr. Evans attends today's meeting to provide us with the necessary professional planning guidance, as he has not been involved with the other consideration of the application under review. Mr. Evans will, however, not be asked to express any views on the merits of the proposed development, and in effect his role will be a neutral one involving the provision of practical information and guidance only. And over to yourself.
Thank you, convener. Hopefully you can all see the agenda slides there. So yes, the second case before members today is a request for review against an application refused under delegated powers for the formation of a dormer window to the rear and installation of roof lights to the front at 189 Bonaccord Street. The accompanying PowerPoint slides begin at page 63 of the agenda pack. So again, this review was found to have been submitted with all the necessary information and within the time limit of 3 months following the appointed officer's decision. The applicant has indicated in this case that no new matters which weren't before the appointed officer have been raised in the review submissions, and in terms of procedure by which the review will be conducted, the applicants expressed satisfaction that the review may proceed based on proceed to conclusion without further procedure, so just based on these submissions. I'll provide some background to the case and then hand back to you, convener, for members to decide how they wish to proceed. So just a site description first. The property at 189 Bonaccord Street is a 2-storey detached dwelling house of traditional granite construction, and it's on the eastern side of Bonaccord Street, just south of Ferry Hill House Hotel. Got a sort of image from our GIS system there as well, which is a little clearer, and then an aerial view too. Also have a street view image, which perhaps gives you a better better feel for the property we're talking about. It's just this one in the middle of the shop with brown windows there. So the application property fronts Bonaccord Street and is constructed with granite walls and a pitched slated roof, with front elevation featuring a small gablet and bay window at ground floor. The front slope of the roof features one existing roof light, which you can't see from that image, but I think it's just tucked in here somewhere, with a further 2 roof lights on the rear slope. Windows are formed in brown stained timber with sash and case frames to the front and casement frames to the rear. Sizable rear gardens enclosed by a granite rubble boundary wall. The site lies within the Ferry Hill Conservation Area and within an area that the local development plan identifies as an H1 residential area. In terms of planning history, the appointed officer's report draws attention to the refusal of a previous application for a dormer window at the rear in October of 2019. The agents for the case at that time sought to appeal the decision via the LRB, but submissions were made too late, out with the 3-month period allowed for seeking review. So turning to the proposal, we've got the existing images on the left and proposed on the right. So that's the existing roof light I mentioned before. So planning permission sought for the erection of a box dormer window to the rear of the dwelling, as well as 2 roof lights on the front slope. One of those is formed by enlarging this opening that's already there to install a slightly larger roof light, and then one's entirely new. As part of the works, to form the new dormer, it's proposed that the roof ridge be raised by about 13 centimetres, going by the drawings, in order to accommodate the head height in the rear dormer. So flicking to the rear elevation, the dormer is of a flat roofed box style and would measure approximately 5 metres wide by 2.8 metres high. Its rear face features wood effect UPVC fascias and 2 wood effect UPVC tilt and turn windows with vertical slated panels and aprons between and below the windows. So that's just referring to this section between the windows, and the aprons just the area immediately below, and that helps to provide the additional head height. The sides of the dormer are also clad in slates with wood effect UPVC fascias. That's this part along here, continuing around the side, just like that. So one entirely new roof window is proposed in the front slope of the roof, with an existing roof light replaced and put within an enlarged opening. In terms of the accommodation at the attic level, this is a section that perhaps shows better the increase in the roof ridge height there. So what happens is essentially the roof becomes slightly asymmetrical and it continues along up that way a little bit, if that makes sense. Yeah, so this was the slide I was looking for there. So in terms of the attic level accommodation, this provides for the formation of a bedroom with shower room and stair within the attic space. And these red squares just indicate the Velux roof lights going in there. So I can come back to those, but the appointed officer's reasons for refusal, these are set out in full in the decision notice, which is at pages 95 to 97 of the agenda. Just sort of summarising, makes the following key points. Firstly, the scale of the proposed dormer is seen to dominate the rear roof slope by virtue of its height and massing. The size of the 2 windows within the proposed box dormer don't reflect the established fenestration pattern on the rear of the application property. So really that's just saying that the position and orientation of those windows doesn't match the floors below. The dormer is not of a scale and design that respects the character and appearance of the application property. It was concluded that there would be visual harm to the character and appearance of the Ferry Hill Conservation Area. Ultimately, the proposal was seen as being at odds with policy D1 relating to quality placemaking by design, D4 relating to the historic environment, and H1 relating to residential areas, as well as relevant guidance contained within the Householder Development Guide. Lastly, it was stated that the proposal would not accord with the relevant national guidance published by Historic Environment Scotland. At that point, oh, sorry, sorry, I was about to hand back to you there, convener, a little bit prematurely. In terms of the appellant's case, this is set out in the notice of review and an accompanying statement appendices. All documents are available via the web portal, with the statement itself at pages 107 to 114 of the agenda. Following main points are made. Firstly, attention is drawn to other box dormers in the local area, noting that these are now an accepted feature of properties in this section of Bonaccord Street. Highlights that the neighbouring properties at 191 and 193 have box dormers of a similar type to that proposed. Notes that the proposed dormer would not be visible from the public road, and therefore its visual impact on Bonaccord Street would be negligible. And contends that the rear of the property is an appropriate location for this form of extension, as evidenced by the number and variety of extensions and dormers to the rear of neighbouring properties. The applicant notes provision within the Householder Development Guide for standards to be relaxed on such non-public elevations, and in instances where there may be other such extensions present. Excuse me. And lastly, contends that the dormer would not dominate the original roof slope, and that other criteria set out in the guidance have in fact been satisfied. In terms of consultations, there were no representations made from members of the public, and there was no response from the local Ferryhill and Rutherston Community Council. And at that point, convener, I'll just hand back to you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Evans. Mr. Evans, before I ask members if they have enough information, could you go to a Google view, so that we can see over the wider area rather than just a specific view of the house, so that we could...
A street view or an aerial?
An aerial one, just to give us an idea of the rear of properties.
I've got an aerial one here in the slides. I'll see if that's of any use first. Sorry, forgot I wasn't sharing my screen there. I'm sure, is that any good?
It's a little bit far. Yeah. Even with my glasses on, if we could have got some, if we could maybe go into Google Maps or whatever. Oh, that's good. You're getting a bit closer.
Zoom on the screen if that helps.
Yeah, I'm just having a look to see what I can see from that.
You can see some dormers, for example.
Vina, there's actually a view on page 109 of that.
Yeah. You think that was? Yeah, I looked at that, but it wasn't very. Between my eyes. That. Because I know they've highlighted in different colours the houses that have got rear extension.
I can see if I can get a Google image up, and that would be clearer if you like.
Yeah, please, Mr. Evans. I just would like to be a little bit surer. I know we've looked. I don't know if Councillor Mackenzie, you were there when we had one before, and certainly I know myself and Councillor Duncan found it really useful.
I'm told I'll be getting a new laptop shortly, so hopefully this will be a bit quicker in the future.
That's okay, no problem, Mr. Evans. I try and blame my tools, but it's actually the person working them, so I'd be absolutely useful.
I think there might be an element of that in this case as well. Right. So first of all, I'll just stop sharing that screen and see if we can get this. Can everybody see that? Okay. It's
yeah,
a bit
that's
clearer, certainly.
Yeah. And which that's it there. Okay. And this is to the rear of what's called Hannah's Guest House, I'm assuming. Is that they're suggesting that box dormers? Is that right?
I think that's one that's highlighted in the applicant submission. Yeah. In fact, in the street view image, you can sort of see the dormer peeking out as well.
Okay. And then there's nothing on the other side. I'm just trying to.
There's a sort of number of dormers down on this section, but they look to be the sort of pinned, more traditional style. That looks like one big box dormer.
Yeah. I'm not a fan of box dormers, but I'm trying to remain neutral until I give it a full consideration. Okay. Is that helpful for people just to see the sort of the mixture of rear extensions and types of dormers to the rear? Does anyone, Mr. Evans, any slide before he takes it down? No. Okay. No, that's been helpful, Mr. Evans. Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Members, if we take go back, we now need to consider whether we have sufficient information in front of us today to take a decision on the application. Members will note that the applicant has stated that in the review documents that the local review body should proceed without any further procedure. Members, remember that if you do not feel you have enough information to take a decision, you can request that a site visit be undertaken, that further written information be provided, or that a hearing be arranged. Councillor Mackenzie.
I feel we have sufficient information.
Okay, thank you.
The agenda and Mr. Evans' presentation just now.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Bell?
Yes, Camina, there is sufficient information.
Thank you. I'm satisfied now, having seen the aerial view, which was one thing that I just wanted to clarify, so that's been very helpful. So as members feel that they have sufficient information, we'll now hear from Mr. Evans on the relevant policies and consideration for the report.
Thank you, convener. Just getting the screen up again here. So as I mentioned, I can go back to the plans and elevations at any point if that helps. Just quickly talk us through the relevant policy considerations. So as I mentioned, this again is within an H1 residential area, and policy H1 sets out criteria for new development. Firstly, proposals should not constitute overdevelopment and should not have an unacceptable impact on the character and amenity of the surrounding area. So that second point requires members to come to a view on how you feel this proposal would affect the character and amenity of the surrounding area, and what in fact you feel that character is at present. There's reference to public open space, that's not relevant to this case. And lastly, compliance with relevant supplementary guidance. In this case, that supplementary guidance is a householder development guide, which sets out quite detailed specifications for new dormer windows on both traditional and more modern properties. The householder development guide sets out general principles for all types of adaptation, and then follows on with specific guidance for dormer windows. So first and foremost, proposals should be architecturally compatible in design and scale with the original house and with the surrounding area. Extensions should not dominate or overwhelm the original house, and extensions should remain visually subservient. No extension should result in a situation where amenity of neighbouring properties would be adversely affected in terms of privacy, daylight, or general amenity. And footprint of a dwelling, that's not relevant in this case because footprint wouldn't be increased through the dormer window. Earlier developments approved before this guidance was introduced will not be accepted as justification in support of proposals that otherwise fail to comply with these criteria. So what we're effectively saying there is that bad examples from the past when this guidance wasn't in effect shouldn't be used as a benchmark or as a justification. So moving on to dormer windows specifically, in general terms, new dormer windows should respect the scale of the building and should not dominate, overwhelm, or unbalance the original roof. In terraces or blocks of properties of uniform design where there are no existing dormers, construction of new dormers would not be supported, and that point's actually less relevant, so I wouldn't focus on that. In the case of listed buildings in conservation areas, in the case of non-listed buildings in conservation areas, consideration may be given to the provision of linked panels between windows on the private side of a building, where the extension is not seen from any public area. Non-traditional style dormers may be accepted on the rear of non-listed buildings in conservation areas, but generally not on any elevation of listed buildings. So as we heard, this building isn't listed, but it is within a conservation area. So what that point is saying is, yes, slated linking panels between windows and dormers may be acceptable, but only to the rear or non-public side of the building. So another list of criteria, I'm afraid. Dormer windows on older properties of a traditional character and specific to the rear elevation. The aggregate area of all dormers should not dominate the original roof slope. Dormer haffet should be a minimum of 400 millimeters from the inside face of gable tabling. The front face of dormer extension should be a minimum of 400 meters back from the front edge of the roof, but not so far back that the dormer appears to be pushed unnaturally up the roof slope. Flat roofs on box dormers should be a reasonable distance below the ridge. If I just perhaps flick back, so the section is perhaps relevant there. So flat roofs on box dormers should be a reasonable distance below the ridge. That's obviously a bit of a vague term, but you know, it's open to members to consider what you feel is reasonable. In this case, obviously, we're looking at the existing roof ridge being adapted to accommodate the dormer rather than the dormer being altered to fit in with the existing roof and its ridge. Windows should be located at the ends of box dormers. You can see that the windows are at both ends. A small apron may be permitted below a rear window, and solid panels between windows in box dormers may be permitted but should not dominate the dormer elevation. So that's the sort of slated infill panels that we're talking about, and that's the apron below the window. So again, I can come back to those, but just moving on to roof lights now. As you heard, we have 2 roof lights on the front elevation of the property as well. And the guidance sets out criteria for those also. Firstly, they should have a conspicuously vertical proportion because the appearance will be foreshortened when seen from ground level. On older buildings, and particularly listed buildings and buildings in conservation areas, a conservation style roof light will be expected. Of particular importance on public elevations. Generally, conservation style roof lights are lower profile, generally a little bit smaller, and feature a central glazing bar just to try and replicate the sort of traditional appearance more closely than the standard product. For roof lights fitted into slated roofs, special flashings can keep the projection above the roof plane to a minimum. And on listed buildings and buildings in conservation areas, it is expected that roof lights will be recessed into the roof rather than projecting up above it. If we just flick back to the section there. Oh. Sorry, I was trying to zoom on that. Don't think it'll let me. But yeah, you can see the existing or the proposed roof light there. And the specification of that isn't entirely clear from the drawing, so it might be that further information on that could be required if members were minded to approve. So moving on from roof lights, policy D1, as we heard before, relates to all developments and requires development to be of a high standard of design, which demonstrates an understanding of its context and links to the 6 qualities of good placemaking. Policy D4 relates to the historic environment. I'm afraid I don't actually have a slide for that one in the presentation, but its requirement is that the City Council will protect, preserve and enhance the historic environment in line with Scottish planning policy, and high quality design that respects the character, appearance and setting of the historic environment will be supported. And lastly, a further material consideration is the Ferry Hill Conservation Area Character Appraisal. and this includes a SWOT analysis of the existing conservation area undertaken in 2013 at the time of this document's publication, and that identifies that pressure for small-scale alterations, such as window replacements and extensions, can have a cumulative and adverse effect on the area's character, and points to that pressure as being a threat to the character of the conservation area. So really just reminding us that the detailing and quality of design within conservation areas should be given careful consideration. And really that's the summary of policy issues concluded. Ultimately, what I would say is that key points to focus on: compliance with policy H1 relating to residential areas. Would it have an adverse impact on character and amenity? Would the proposal comply with the relevant supplementary guidance on both roof lights and on dormer windows? And is the proposal of an appropriate design quality to be consistent with policy D1 and appropriate to our conservation area, consistent with policy D4? Happy to assist with conditions or reasons if necessary. Hand back to you there, Convener. Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry, thank you very much, Mr. Evans. Councillor Mackenzie, have you got questions for Mr. Evans?
No, it's been covered very well.
Councillor Bell.
Convener, yes, I think I do have a question. So, Mr. Evans, the road side of the property, so clearly the rear side is, not a lot of people can see that, but clearly the roadside can. So I'm intrigued about the arrangement of these windows, and they, from the drawing that I've got, it looks like they have become more square than vertical, which because of foreshortening would be even more exacerbated from the road side. So what does that actually? So clearly this has been made a conservation area for important reasons. So what does that actually do? I'm asking your opinion now. I don't know if I'm allowed to do that, but what does that actually do for a house line? If the roof windows appear to be more rectangular than vertical. Am I allowed to ask that question?
Sorry, did you say what does it do for the house line?
Yeah. What's it? So if I'm looking, sorry, if I'm looking at it from the street, how do I? What is my perception of that? I know the shape, but what would I actually? What would I think? I mean, this is using your experience now.
Yeah, I mean, roof lights are generally a much less invasive and obtrusive addition than a dormer window. What I would say is that the size of them needs to be carefully considered in more traditional properties, because sometimes roof lights can be particularly large, especially modern ones. And if one of those is installed in a sort of traditional granite and slate property, you could get the perception that the appearance is a little bit jarring in terms of a modern addition to a more traditional property. Exactly what this would look like from ground level, I couldn't say. It's always quite difficult to envisage, but they are vertical in their proportion to some extent. Whether they need to be more vertically emphasized in order to offset that foreshortening effect, I couldn't say for certain.
Well, I noticed, Convener, that the form of the window has actually changed by about 20% from what I can see. So it's actually become more square by 20%, if you will. So that there's another 20% added to the top, to the vertical height of that window. So it's amusing. I also, just in passing as well, I mean, I was intrigued to see that there's an automatic closing fire door giving 30 minutes of flame retardancy in the drawing. So does that indicate that this modification is a fire hazard? No, it's just me musing.
I think that'll simply be a requirement of current building regulations. I think I couldn't pretend to be entirely intimate with the subtleties of that, but I think there is a requirement for fire doors, perhaps at a certain level, above ground level, something along those lines, perhaps.
Great, thanks.
Any other questions, Councillor Bell?
No.
Thanks. Can I just ask Mr. Evans, if we obviously we've got the recommendation of refusal and the reason, the summary of the reason for the recommendation. Now, I've read it. If you read it, sounds good. I've missed something, but it doesn't seem to focus on the front elevation. It just seems to be the rear dormer elevation that has. Am I correct in my understanding?
Yes, I think that's a fair comment. I think the reasons for refusal are very much geared towards the scale and form of the box dormer, and the roof light doesn't really feature. Certainly in the reasons for refusal, and in reading the delegated report, there's no real focus on those.
Yeah, that's what I thought. I mean, it's quite a difficult one. Could we just go back to the sort of the designs of the rear dormer, just so that we could see it from, if we were looking at it rather than the side?
Sure. Just that slide there.
Yeah, that's fine. I obviously I can't, because he's got all this red pen on it.
Yeah, sorry, that was my addition, just to highlight the changes.
I was just trying to work out, is that right up to the ridge?
The section's perhaps the best way to see that. Unfortunately, the chimney gets in the way a little bit in the side elevations, but so there's that. If you can just see that white sort of semicircle, that's the existing ridge. That's how the ridge has been altered, and you see that the roof line of the dormer is essentially right at ridge level, which is why it's been altered to give the effect of being below ridge level, when perhaps it wouldn't otherwise be without putting a false ridge on.
Yeah. And can you just remind me, the guidance for the dormer recommends it's how much below?
I think it refers to a reasonable distance below the ridge, which obviously requires you to come to your own view on what is reasonable.
Yeah. As you say, it's open for interpretation a little bit on that element. I mean, my big concern, I don't think I've got probably any more questions for you, Mr. Evans, but if we can now just move into discuss the application itself.
If I could just add, convener, sorry to interrupt there. Just in terms of what's reasonable, a reasonable distance below the ridge line, just for context, what's being got at there really is that if a dormer window is a reasonable distance below the ridge line, then when seen from ground level, you might still be able to see the ridge line. Whereas if it's immediately right up to the ridge line, then all you see of the roof is the dormer window. So I think that's partly what that's getting at.
Oh, that's super. Thank you, Mr. Evans. That's helpful. Part of my issue is, obviously we're in a conservation area, and what we want to do is keep the best features that have been identified as making a conservation area. I recognise there's a lot of houses in the area that has a variety of extensions, including dormers of this nature. However, as we've heard from Mr. Evans previously, we shouldn't take new examples against what perhaps was bad examples or of a particular planning policy at that time. However, saying all of that, I think for me, I'm not concerned about the front elevation, because I think the report, the officer, when he's doing his report, hasn't really referenced that as being an issue. But I am very conscious that we need to make these houses livable for today's generation, and that way we retain them. But it's about how we retain them, and is there probably a slightly better style of dormer that might be more appropriate, which may look at a slightly adapted version of the dormer, the rear. Again, I'm not a big fan of dormer windows, but I'm remaining neutral in terms of giving it full consideration for this application. But I do wonder if there's maybe a slight adapted style that might be more in keeping with the conservation area. But what we have to determine is what's in front of us today. I'll stop for a moment and maybe I'll take Councillor Bell for a change first. Councillor Bell, what you're thinking here?
I would at the rear of the property, whatever's done there doesn't appear to be setting any sort of precedent in the area. Now, that's working on the basis that all the other changes have had planning permission. I've got to work on the basis that they have had planning permission. So that wouldn't worry me at all. It would be because of the conservation of the area, would be the road side actually giving me a little more concern, and the aspect of the aspect ratio of the new roofline windows. I'm wondering if they could be made more vertical, longer, as opposed to more rectangular, to actually be in keeping with the rest of the street. But without actually seeing what that would look like on a drawing, it's from a distance, it's very hard to judge. That's not particularly helpful, I know, but that's...
Yeah. I suppose I veered away from being too focused on the front elevation, because that wasn't really the crux of the refusal of the application by the officer. It was about the rear dormer. Councillor Mackenzie, can you shed any helpful comments on this one?
It's the rear dormer that I'm concerned about, because I just feel that it's way overdeveloped.
As I say, I think we absolutely accept the premise that people want to extend their properties, and but obviously in this case, they're choosing to extend into the roof as opposed to out to the rear. But for me at the moment, I'm just slightly uncomfortable that the design of the rear dormer is not as sympathetic as it could be, and I do think we could still achieve that extension with perhaps a modified version. So I'd be inclined to uphold the officer's recommendation. Councillor Mackenzie.
Yes, I uphold the recommendation.
Councillor Bell.
Yes, I would defer to expert opinion of the officer's recommendation.
Okay. So with that in consideration, we have a unanimous decision to uphold the officer's recommendation. It's not we're against a roof extension, but I think we all have concerns that perhaps a dormer is not as in keeping with the area. Okay. Are you happy with that, Mr. Masson?
Yeah, that was clear. That was a unanimous decision.
Thank you. Now turning to consideration of the third review in respect to the decision to refuse the application for formation of dormers and a balcony with deck area to the rear retrospective, which means it's already in place, at 39 Creighton Terrace. Planning reference 1191756/DPP. We will hear from the planning advisor, Mr. Gavin Evans, who will provide us with a brief description of the application proposal and a reminder of the reason why the application was refused. We would again point out that Mr. Evans attends today's meeting to provide us with necessary professional planning guidance, because he has not been involved in the earlier consideration of the application under review. Mr. Evans will not, however, be asked to express any views on the merit of the proposed development, and in effect, his role will be a neutral one involving the provision of factual information and guidance only. Over to yourself, Mr. Evans.
Thank you, Convener. Again, I'll just share my screen here. Everyone see that okay?
Yes, thank you.
Great. So yes, thank you. As you mentioned, this case relates to an application which was made for planning permission for the formation of dormers and balcony with deck area to the rear of 39 Creighton Terrace, and the application was made retrospectively, meaning that the works have already been carried out. I'll get to the planning history of all that shortly. Excuse me, the accompanying PowerPoint slides begin at page 115 of the agenda pack. This review again was found to have been submitted with all the necessary information, and within the time limit of 3 months following the appointed officer's decision. And the applicant has indicated on the notice of review that no new matters have been raised in the review submissions, and in terms of the procedure by which the review will be conducted, the applicant's expressed satisfaction that the review may proceed to a conclusion without further procedure being required. So I'll just give some background to the case before handing back to you, convener, to consider what procedure would be required. So starting off again with a location plan and an aerial photo, the application site lies on the south side of Craigton Terrace, outlined in red on the screen there, and comprises a 1.5-storey semi-detached house with an adjoining garage and associated front and rear gardens. The property is constructed in pink and grey granite with a partially hipped slate roof. What I would say is, that's the aerial view there. We have a street view image. However, this is a very old street view image from Google in 2014, seems to be the most recent one. So since this photo was taken, a planning permission that was obtained in 2017 has been implemented, albeit with some changes that we're now looking at today. So the property's been extended out in a manner similar to the one next door, in fact, so out across the garage with a partial hip. So just bear that in mind when looking at that slide. So there are 3 pitched roof dormers to the front elevation. In that image you can see only one, whilst to the rear there are 3 cat slide dormers. So that's the before shot, and this is the after. So this is the 3 dormer windows with the cat slide style roof we're talking about. A flat roofed extension, also shown in this photo, projects 4 meters beyond the original rear building line, with a raised terrace projecting a further 3 meters from that. 2 of the 3 rear dormers that are shown on this slide, that's the 2 leftmost ones, formed part of an earlier planning approval from 2017, but haven't been constructed in accordance with the approved plans. The rear garden is enclosed by a 1.8 high timber fence. So to try and cover the planning history, lastly, again, we're in an H1 residential area, so policy H1. So this is the left-hand dormer as built. So what planning permission was granted for, if I move on to another slide here, was just a normal dormer window in 3 parts. And what's been constructed is this glazed door with 2 fixed glazed panels at either side, and then that opens out. In this shot shows it opening out onto the roof. So first and foremost, there was application in 2017, which was approved in November of that year, for a 1.5-storey gable extension, the formation of dormers to the front and rear, and single-storey extension and decking to the rear. In 2018, a revised application came in. That was withdrawn in January of 2019, and then most recently in January of this year, a planning application for the formation of dormers, balcony and deck area to the rear that we're currently considering was refused. So I can try and talk through that on slides, because I'm aware there's a bit of backstory to get to. So this is the original approval from 2017. And what you'll note is that on the left-hand image, we just have a traditional dormer, no apron below, no opportunity to open out onto the roof space. And note also the size of the middle dormer there, with 4 windows and a degree of spacing between it and its neighbouring dormers. This is the floor space just from that same. So this is the left-hand dormer here. Again, you see there's no opportunity to open out onto the roof space. So that was what planning permission was granted for. Second set of images is the application from 2018 that was withdrawn. Now this introduced the dropping of the sill level to include the glass opening door. It also included a glass balustrade around a rooftop terrace area, which is perhaps better shown on the plan view here. So at that point, this was introduced to the mix, and that application was withdrawn. Most likely because the officer at that point indicated that the planning authority had issues with the proposal. That tends to be the case when applications are withdrawn. So then the third image, or third set of images, is what has recently been refused in this current application. So again, we have the glazed door, this time with a sort of glass balustrade and handrail across it. And you'll note that the dormer window has been enlarged, so it's now 6 parts and is enlarged with a much narrower gap between it and the immediately adjoining dormers. So how that manifests itself in the floor plan, there's no longer a terrace shown. Now there's the handrail and a small area of timber deck shown just in the sloping section of the roof, if you like. And in terms of the width of the dormer window that's been enlarged, that has taken away previous lie-ins, or coombs as they're called, that were above the bath. So if I can zoom in on, no, I can't zoom in on that for some reason. Sorry, user error. There we go. So in the withdrawn scheme and in the consented scheme, the scale of the dormer was such that there were lie-ins above the bath on both of the upstairs bathrooms. So the increase to the dormer here has allowed for those lie-ins to be removed. So you can't quite see it, but that dashed line now continues down here as opposed to going over the bath. Hope that makes sense.
Yeah.
So this is the side elevation as built. You can see the cat slide nature of the roof of the dormer. This is a continuation of the rear roof, and you'll see that the balustrade or handrail that's shown goes no further than that point. So the extent of any rooftop terrace is essentially akin to like a Juliet balcony where you could have a little seat, and that's about it. So I hadn't even got to the proposal yet in my notes. So what planning permissions retrospectively sought for is this, the formation of 2 dormers to the rear of the property, both of a cat slide style, and the centrally positioned dormer serving 2 ensuite bathrooms measuring 4 meters wide and 1.25 meters high, with 6 clear glazed windows. The outermost dormer, so that's this one here with the doorway, measures 2 meters wide by 2 meters high and incorporates full height glazed panels either side of a glazed door. Finishing materials for the dormers include white UPVC framed windows and slates to match the existing roof. In terms of the appointed officer's reasons for refusal, these make reference to the dormers being of inappropriate scale and design, appearing particularly dominant on the roof slope, and failing to address the requirements of the Council's supplementary guidance on householder development, which states that new dormers or roof extensions should respect the scale of the building and should not dominate, overwhelm, or unbalance the original roof. The introduction of direct access via the glazed door onto the first level, onto a first floor level balcony, in conjunction with the enlarging of the dormer window and increased glazing, was seen as raising concerns regarding the potential for overlooking and impact on privacy and residential amenity for neighbours. The proposal was therefore considered to be contrary to the requirements of policies D1 relating to design quality and H1 relating to residential areas, as well as the Council's householder development supplementary guidance. No material considerations were identified that the officer felt would warrant approval in this instance. So the appellant's case, there's a statement provided at pages 179 to 181 of the agenda, and the main points are as follows. Highlights that many neighbouring properties have been altered, many including dormer windows which are totally unsympathetic to their surroundings. Examples are included of the variety seen in dormer windows locally. States that the proposals are consistent with the design of existing dormers and those of the adjoining property and are sympathetic to their surroundings. highlights that the rear dormers in question and balcony can't be seen from Craigton Terrace or Gordon Road, and states that compromises made to obtain the initial planning permission led to an unworkable floor area and the lions or coombe areas that we saw in the upstairs bathrooms. It's clarified that glass on all bathroom windows will be or has been treated with obscure film, so that the degree of overlooking would be negated. It's clarified that the flat-roofed extension has not been designed to take extra loads, for example, a roof terrace or balcony, nor to accommodate the required safety barriers. So I think what the applicant's attempting to do there is to clarify that the structure does not provide for the potential for a roof terrace without significant alteration, given the way it's been constructed. The door onto the balcony allows for only one person due to the presence of balustrade, and it notes that there is no significant change to the views that were previously afforded from first floor windows. So it's referring to the perceived privacy impact there. In terms of consultation, the local Braeside and Mannifield Community Council provided no response. There were 5 letters of objection at the time, all from addresses on Craigton Terrace and Gordon Road. Gordon Road being the street which sits immediately opposite the rear boundary. If I just go back to the location plan. So yeah, Gordon Road is along here. So objections were received from residents on this street and on the street immediately behind. In addition to those 5 letters of objection, 2 of those original respondents have provided further comments on submission of the review. All representations are included at pages 155 to 170 of the agenda pack, with the agent's response at 183 to 184. Matters raised as follows. The as-built structure is markedly different to what planning permission was obtained for. If approved, the roof terrace or balcony would impact on existing privacy with overlooking of neighbouring gardens. There's potential to extend the roof, potential to extend the area of roof terrace or balcony in the future with relative ease. The rear dormer, which serves 2 bathrooms, is considerably larger than what was approved and includes clear glass which introduces overlooking and affects privacy. Just a reminder, we heard before from the applicant that would be fitted with an obscure film. If approved, this was seen as establishing an undesirable precedent for future development along the street. The design of the development was found to be out of character with the surrounding area. Access to clean the roof window is possible by a ladder with no need to access via a door. Noise and nuisance will likely be an issue with increased and elevated access to the roof. Supplementary comments lodged on notification of the applicant's review reiterate those concerns, ultimately not accepting the applicant's supporting arguments and reaffirming objection. Respondents also characterise the situation as a deliberate flouting of planning control. At that point, convener, I would just hand back to you for members to consider what procedure would be applied in this case. So I'll just cancel my screen there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Evans. Members, we now need to consider whether we have sufficient information in front of us today to take a decision. Members will note that the applicant has stated in the review of documents that the local review body should proceed without any further procedure before determination. So, Councillor Bell, are you content to proceed, or do you require any further information?
Convener, I believe there is sufficient information with some clarification from Mr. Evans.
Okay, thank you. And Mr. Evans, I was going to say, Councillor Mackenzie.
I believe there's sufficient information being provided.
I am like-minded. I feel we've got enough information, and we have photographs of various other houses as well as applicants, which will allow us to determine the application today. With that in mind, I will hand back to Mr. Evans if you could go through the relevant policies. Thank you.
Sorry, I just realised I had my microphone still muted there. Thank you, convener. So, as I mentioned, again, we're within a predominantly residential area where policy H1 applies. Same tests as covered previously. Does the proposal constitute overdevelopment? Would it have an unacceptable impact on the character and amenity of the surrounding area? Would it comply with the relevant supplementary guidance, in this case being the Householder Development Guide, which has content on dormer windows? So turning to the Householder Development Guide, again, the same general principles for alterations generally. It should be architecturally compatible in design and scale with the original house and the surrounding area. Shouldn't dominate or overwhelm the original house, and extensions should remain visually subservient. Should not have an adverse impact on privacy, daylight or amenity for neighbouring residents. Footprint of dwelling not relevant, and approvals predating the guidance which was adopted in 2017 wouldn't be accepted as a precedent. So specific to dormer windows, new dormers should respect the scale of the building and should not dominate, overwhelm or unbalance the original roof. On individual properties or in terraces where there are existing well-designed dormers and where there's adequate roof space, the construction of new dormers which match those existing may be acceptable. You'll see from the earlier elevations that the starting point for the consented scheme was the existing dormer on the rear part of the roof, and that sort of was the influence for the design of the other dormers. Additional dormers will not be permitted, however, if this results in the roof appearing overcrowded. These dormers should be closely modelled in their detail and position on the roof on the existing good examples, and they will normally be aligned with windows on floor levels below. Again, there's a bit of repetition in this, I'm afraid. Dormers should not appear to dominate the original roof. Dormers should not be built directly off the wall head. That's not the case in this instance. Small apron below windows may be acceptable on rear elevations. There's no apron shown on these dormers. The roof of the dormer should not extend to or beyond the ridge of the original roof. Again, in this case, not going any closer to the roof than was previously to the ridge line, than was previously approved. Flat roof dormers should generally be a minimum of 600 millimeters below the existing roof ridge. Again, in the relationship with the roof ridge hasn't changed from what was approved. It's going in the opposite direction. Dormer should be a minimum of 600 millimeters in from the gable. Again, not getting any closer to the gable, the edge of the roof. Outermost windows should be positioned at the extremities of dormers. That is the case. Perhaps best if I just flick back to the slide, so you can see that glazing is at the extremities of all the dormers. There's no solid panels there. Finishes should match those of the original building, and wherever possible, window proportion and arrangement should echo those on the floor below. Obviously, on the floor below, we have a new extension as well, so the original rear elevation of the property is largely obscured. So the degree to which that's significant is perhaps reduced as a result. And lastly, design and scale of any new dormer should take account of the design and scale of existing dormers. So what I was mentioning before was that this existing dormer seemed to be the starting point for the original approval. If I go back
Gavin, can I just ask one question before you move away from the slide?
please.
The dormer to the right of the one you've got had your hand on, is that the neighbour?
Yes, that's the neighbouring property.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure because I was wondering how they're fitting all that on. Okay, that's fine, thank you.
Yeah, so the existing dormer on this property had obviously been designed in the same sort of style as the neighbouring property, and then this seems to have formed the basis for how these other dormers would be designed. And what we've seen over the passage of time and various revisions to the proposal is that central dormer has become much wider, and the left-hand dormer has obviously got the sill dropped. So there's perhaps two separate components for you to consider there. So if I just skim back through again, I can go back to the elevations at any point, just let you know. The Householder Development Guide also refers to decking, not in any great detail, but just sets out that proposals should not result in an adverse impact on the amenity of adjacent dwellings, including both internal accommodation and external private amenity space. So really what that's saying is we should be looking at the amenity and privacy impacts of any new decking areas and how that would affect both internal space in the neighbouring house and also their private rear garden. So turning to policy D1, again, applicable to all developments, requires development to be of a high standard of design, which demonstrates an understanding of its context. So really that sums up the policy summary. Main points for consideration: does the proposal comply with policy H1 as regards impact on character and amenity of the surrounding area? Does it comply with the relevant Householder Development Guide on dormer windows and decking? Is the design appropriate in terms of policy D1? Happy to assist with any questions. Thank you very much.
Can I just ask a question before we kind of get into further questions? Obviously, we have an application before us, which is for the entirety of the changes that weren't authorised, if you like. Now, if, for instance, and I think I know the answer to this already, but I think probably for Councillor Bell and Councillor Mackenzie, if, for instance, we were reasonably content with, for instance, the middle windows, the change to the 4 panels or whatever it is, rather than the originally approved, and perhaps if the bathroom windows, rather than having sticky plastic on them, those panels could be replaced by proper glass panels that were obscured. But we wanted the window, which had become a door, changed back to window and no balcony. I mean, what is the scope of us being able to, can we just say that as an advisory note? Because obviously I appreciate we've got to deal with what's in front of us and its entirety they've asked for approval on. But I do recall there was not a similar, but another application where the principle we weren't unhappy with somewhere else, but there were certain elements that didn't give us enough comfort. So we asked that if they wish to submit another application in the future, that we would be minded that that part was acceptable, however this part weren't. Can I get a bit of guidance on that from either yourself?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I think ultimately, I think you maybe know the answer I'm going to give there, Convener. Yeah. We're considering the entirety of the proposal that's before us, but yeah, if members were satisfied with one component of the proposal and not another, you could make that quite clear in your reasons for your decision, and that decision then becomes a material consideration for the planning authority to have regard to in any subsequent applications.
Okay, that's fine. And that was what I thought, but I wanted to make sure that we had it recorded for all of our information. So with that in mind, questions for Mr. Evans. Councillor Mackenzie.
Trying to use the wrong mouse to unmute. The dormers, are they 600 millimetres from the gable?
Yes. Sorry, I'm just skimming back to the plan. I think the drawing says something like 1300 even. I think they're comfortably more than 600 mil, and in any event that hadn't changed from what was previously approved, if you see what I mean. So.
Okay. Any other questions, Councillor Mackenzie?
No, that's it.
Councillor Bell.
Thank you, Convener. Well, interesting. So, first question, Mr. Evans. So we're told that the roof area hasn't been stressed other than for snow covering. Do you know what it has been stressed for? You know how much snow it constitutes? And I've done a few sums, but do you know what that number is?
No, I don't. That wouldn't be part of the planning application consideration. That would really be for building regulations to specify the sort of strength and structure of the building. So we wouldn't really get involved in that We've obviously been told by the applicant that it's been done to a particular level and not to accommodate anything else in their supporting statement, but we've not verified that.
Thank you. Because in the LRB statement on pages 179 and 180, the chartered architect has specifically said that it isn't stressed for other than for snow covering. So I was wondering whether he produced more than just two page lesser, but maybe not. Okay,
No,
so can I ask another question then, please? You spoke about a balustrade. I mean, there appears to be. I see drawings, but they're not being adhered to. So designs aren't being adhered to. So is there a balustrade? Do you understand it to be retrofitted?
Yes, it's a little bit confused because when making a retrospective application, your expectation might be that this is for what we have done, but I think what we're being shown is what we have done and also some other things. Yeah, because the photographs that have been provided don't seem to indicate any sort of balustrade being there. So if members were in other respects comfortable with the proposal subject to that being there, that might be something you would want to condition to ensure that it restricted access to the roof.
Well, but convener, I look at this and I think, okay, there could be a balustrade, but I don't know how deep the balustrade would be. So if you actually moved away from the structural beam and you then got onto the unstressed part of the roof, would that be safe? Would that be safe for a future owner of the property who didn't know what had gone before? So the balustrade could be quite deep, couldn't it? It doesn't have to be just some bars, sort of 30 centimeters deep. It could be a lot deeper than that. I just don't know that.
I mean, there's a degree of detail shown about the enclosure of that balcony space on the drawings. I mean, it gives an indication of the height in the section. I could go back to that slide if that would be helpful.
No, thanks, Mr. Evans. I've got the drawings in front of me, but on the basis that plans haven't been adhered to, how on earth could you guarantee that will be done? I mean, you could, I would be, apart from the disproportionate the roof line, I think the safety is a huge consideration for me.
I mean, if the concern was that a balustrade or means of enclosure for that balcony space is entirely essential, then that's certainly something you could put a planning condition on about. But a planning condition doesn't guarantee something happening. It requires someone to do it in order to be in compliance with their planning permission. And if they don't, there's a breach of planning control. And then the planning authority would need to decide what reasonable steps were warranted in terms of issuing an enforcement notice or whatever else. So
just to clarify for me, please. So if we say, right, this is a condition, the balustrade, and this is the maximum dimension that we would allow, maximum depth of the balustrade. We don't have design drawings. We don't know what the design figures are. You've already told me that. So are we condoning that? Are we condoning and then perhaps putting a deeper balustrade, allowing them to go further out onto the roof?
No, not necessarily. I think it would depend on how you framed the condition. Where there's a degree of uncertainty about what form something would take, it would be reasonable for us to require an applicant to submit further plans to demonstrate exactly what they're proposing, and then to require that it be implemented within a specified timescale, following the planning authority's approval of those details. So that's the sort of way in which you might best try and deal with it. But as I said, planning conditions require someone to do something, but it's not an absolute guarantee that it will happen because people sometimes choose not to.
Right. So could I then ask, if we just say, right, we want these dormers, the doors to be backed out of the as-built. So how on earth could you get that?
Well, you wouldn't be able to do that with a planning condition because ultimately that's altering the nature of the development that they have to seek permission for. So in that sort of context, that would be something that would be considered in terms of an enforcement action. The planning authority would need to consider whether enforcement action is justified and exactly what steps the applicant is expected to take to remedy any breach of planning control. And ultimately, the enforcement side of things is separate to what the LRB has before it today. I appreciate that's a bit frustrating because it all feels like one thing, but we're just considering whether to grant planning permission for this. And if the LRB decides not to do so, then it would go back to our enforcement team to say, well, an application has been made, the appeal route has been exhausted. Now it's for us to consider, well, what further steps are justified here.
Okay, I understand. Thank you.
Any other questions, Councillor Bell?
No, that's it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, thanks, folks. Well, obviously, we can discuss how we want to decide on this application. Again, I have a probably I dislike when people go against what has been approved in terms of the planning application, particularly if it's of a scale that we see here, such as doors instead of windows. I mean, that's pretty fundamental and it shows a deliberate act. However, at the same time, I think we have to have a level of pragmatism. However, that doesn't mean that we approve things that have not been following suit. Me, I haven't got an issue with the change to the middle windows. What I would want to see, if an application were to come back in, would be for the 2 bathroom panels, rather than to have adhesive fixtures, to be of opaque glass to afford a level of privacy to the houses on either side and protect their amenity. I would absolutely want the doors replaced with a window, which is which was originally approved, which again gives a level of uniformity to the roof line. And certainly I wouldn't want to be seeing any rooftop terrace or balcony, because I think that is an invasion of privacy to the adjacent properties, given the proximity that they are. So with that in mind, it would be I would certainly be moving that we uphold the officer's recommendations, but should an application, a further application come in, that material consideration in the determining by the officer. Councillor Bell.
Yes, I believe I believe the refusal should be upheld. And may I just say one more thing as well?
Yes, certainly.
So the doors, depending on which way they open, I suspect they open outwards. You would need a very deep balustrade to ensure they didn't foul on the balustrade, which means you would then be going out on the roof. So I consider the safety alone just precludes it completely.
Yeah. Councillor, sorry. So you're upholding the officer's recommendation, and do you agree with the suggestions that I believe would be a material consideration for
Absolutely,
future?
yes, thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Bell. Councillor Mackenzie.
I agree with points that you put forward, Councillor Bolton. I would uphold the planner's decision.
Mr. Masson, do you need anything further?
Thanks, Chair. No, that was clear again. That was 3 votes to nil for the upholding the planner's refusal.
Okay, and with other points
with the material, yes, with it.
Yeah. Okay, that's super. Okay, well, that concludes the business of the local review body today. If I can thank you all for your attendance, and the recording will now cease.